understanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. So here we are, just the two of us.
Should be interesting, though.
I nearly lost you then, Tarjinder. Yeah, just the two of us. That's all you need, I think, for a good conversation about everything that's going on in education at the moment. So I don't know about you, but I'm at the end of half term.
Yeah, same here. For once, it was the same up here as it is for yourself, where you are as well, which is a bit unusual. I got caught unawares that it was also half term where I live too, because I just didn't quite arrange things quite the right way. So I assumed they'd done it a week earlier, which they normally do. But no, it's been lovely.
Yeah, no, so all good. But of course, we're back to school tomorrow. So shall we start with the idea of a 4-day week then?
Yes, so there's this idea that's clearly on Twitter this morning about, and it's not just the first time it's come up, but the idea that there should be a 4-day working week, and what should be happening on the 5th day is that teachers are still working. So it's not like it's a 3-day weekend for the teachers, but they should be catching up on their workload, marking, etc. And that this will fix it, and it will also help support pupils as well. I think that's the general idea. And they can participate in extracurriculars and have other interventions, which they wouldn't otherwise do. So I think that's being put out there as a theory. I'm not sure that there's anywhere that's actually tried that, though.
No, not in terms of actually a whole 4-day week. No, not that I'm aware of. I think one of the things that you have to ask is how that would go down with parents.
Well, precisely. And I think that would be the initial thing would be actually, well, I suppose if they say the children would be in school, but they wouldn't be in lessons, then that would also create an issue, because who's going to be doing those extracurricular activities in school other than the teachers? You know, unless you're going to give them all to the TAs to do that. But then that would also involve skilling up the teaching assistants so they can actually do those activities while teachers do additional have additional time for marking, etc. But then you have to wonder, given all the innovations that are out there in terms of reducing marking, etc. I know that you can never completely reduce it to nothing, but there have been a lot better interventions. You know, some of the worst aspects of teacher workload, sort of lots of different coloured pens and lots of different sort of, you know, types of, you know, sort of codes, etc. You know, people have actually, I think, gone a bit better in terms of that, in terms of schools that I've seen. No one's had to do kind of insane things that I was doing about 10 years ago, where it just felt like it was endless marking, even in primary, you know, getting feedback on feedback and things like that, which were pointless. So I would wonder where that marking workload has come from, and if there isn't a way to solve it in the first place, and to look at that policy, and also in terms of workload. I mean, there are, like, what is the workload, I suppose? What is a problem that you're trying to solve? Because it seems to me that this is quite an idealistic solution for some people, but they haven't really thought through the practicalities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there are lots of reasons, I think, on a societal level, as well as possibly on an economic level, if we're talking about potential gains in productivity, why a 4-day week is attractive and could work. But I think that so often what happens is conversations happen in certain spheres of life, particularly in certain spheres of corporate life, and they then get transplanted into the world of public services, and in our case, schools. And some things get lost in translation. So, I mean, you know, one of the things I'd like to throw into the pot here, Tarjinder, is the model that I have in my school, which is that we have a 5-day week, but what we do On Monday to Thursday, I say to our staff, our teaching staff, no meetings after school. Apart from senior team, no meetings after school. Um, Extracurricular stuff, great. Planning, marking, so forth, great. But no actual meetings of any sort after school. Then on a Friday, we finish an hour early. So what happens is we actually finish a bit later Monday to Thursday. We finish at 20 to 4 on a Monday to Thursday. So I suppose, you know, that's longer than a lot of schools. But then on a Friday, we finish an hour earlier. So we finish at 2:45. And then what happens is we have all our meetings, you know, training schedule, all of that happens after school on a Friday. Now, you may say, well, that sounds horrific because everybody just wants to cut loose on a Friday afternoon and, you know, they want to, you know, go off and do their own thing. But actually, it's the opposite. What happens is that people feel much more relaxed, more willing to chat and engage, and the meetings don't tend to go on because people, you know, say, I don't want this meeting to drag on and on and on because, you know, it's Friday and I want to get what we need to get done and then we'll get on the way. And it does give you also the facility to cut that hour of training short occasionally. Say, for example, you know, the last Friday before Christmas or the last Friday at the, you know, at the end of the whole school year, things like that. So that then people can, you know, get on. And what I also do is I build into the schedule a certain amount of time when people have additional marking time, which goes down obviously pretty well. So when we have the mock exams that we've just had, there were 2 Fridays when people had, you know, the time after school on Friday was for marking and moderation. Now that clearly is not a 4-day week. That's a 5-day week with an adjustment on the last day. However, it does acknowledge the world is slightly different in the way that it works on a Friday, or at least some parts of the world are slightly different in that sense. And it does at least give an acknowledgement that there are some benefits to having a different style Friday. And certainly we've noticed that the students generally are a little bit more, on the whole, a little bit more, shall we say, easygoing when they know that their Friday consists of, instead of the normal 6 lessons, we actually cut it up into 4 slightly longer lessons. So they know that Friday has a different feel to it, a different structure to it, and that kind of lifts the mood or keeps the mood reasonably good. So I mean, I'm not saying that's the answer to all the problems, or that properly addresses the idea of a 4-day week. But I just think that in the current world, if parents were told that their school was going for 4 days, I think that it would go down like a lead balloon. But I think that if you said to parents, oh well actually, you know, we're just finishing a little bit early so that we do all the meetings and all the training, then I don't think you get a lot of pushback, because we didn't, certainly, when we first suggested it.
You are secondary as opposed to primary, and of course that's got its own
Yeah.
issues because the children are much younger, and for them the stability of the day, of being in school day in day out, the most vulnerable pupils at that age, is really quite vital if we want to provide them with the support they need. Actually, if we kind of mess around with the day too much, I mean, already it happens, you know, you can sort of see it with children, and even children with special needs who might be able to cope better in secondary. Part of it is that sort of almost training that we have to give even in primary, like, you know, you have to be really quite gradually bring them up to, like, okay, it's okay if every lesson that was on the visual timetable hasn't quite happened. You know, we have to go down that route slowly but surely. but they're not going to get that way. So potentially we could be making things much worse for certain groups of children.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Something like that.
Sorry, I jumped in. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, no, and I think equally, the other thing is, I think you're right about parents and how much flexibility they have to work. So again, I think it depends on the parents that you have. So sometimes with these articles, what they're talking about is specific schools that got the idea to do that. And maybe their parents, the parents who send their children there, they do have that flexibility. And that's fine, because maybe they can go ahead and do that. Then the idea is like, oh, why don't we do it for everybody? But what they forget is that that's their context, that's their parents. And actually, if you've got a school where the parents really don't have the flexibility, they're already struggling in terms of work and making ends meet, they really can't take a day off. How do they then make up for that extra day? Who picks up their children? Who does the childcare? All of these things could really tip people over the edge, particularly in terms of costs. You know, even if you can get a friend or a relative to do it, you know, there's still a cost involved, because you are still going to like sort of pay for your kids to have gone round and have eaten there every Friday. You can't even expect your own sort of siblings to keep paying for every Friday. You know, this is not the way that it works. So there's always going to be these hidden costs that people aren't thinking about. So yeah, I think something is very context driven.
Sorry, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. And I'm glad you introduced the primary context into that, because of course I was guilty as charged there of talking as a secondary teacher, and you know, obviously it's a very different world, and in lots of ways. And you're absolutely right. It has considerably different implications for people with much younger children. I'm just going to go through our the word from our sponsors just for a moment. So this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. I'd also like to talk about Teachers Talk Connect. And teachers, join the Teachers Talk radio team in Manchester on Saturday, the 1st of March 2025 for Teachers Talk Connect, our biggest free event ever. Hear from main stage speakers, including Lee Parkinson, otherwise known as Mr. P, Kate Jones, and Vic Goddard, and attend subject-specific CPD sessions and experience amazing network opportunities too. Tickets are free for teachers and leaders. Just visit ttrradio.org to find out more and get your ticket today. Okay, so back to what we're talking about then, Tarjinder. So yeah, I was just saying about primary schools and how things are different. But I think you raised an interesting point also, which I think again, you know, was spot on. And that was that in a world where we're trying to get young people to engage more with other young people and attend school, and we're addressing their mental health issues. The last thing that we want to do is cut young people off from structure and other young people and having a routine in their lives, because I think that would be wholly unhelpful for their mental health, and it wouldn't necessarily be particularly good in terms of preparing them for their future lives.
No, and I think, it's something that I've sort of come around to as well, which is that, look, ultimately we cannot have a complete one-size-fits-all system for everybody. It just can't happen. Because no matter what our preferences are, even in terms of teaching pedagogy or the rest of it, it's all very well, because I'm obviously quite trad, but that doesn't mean that I don't think the Brit school should exist. That doesn't mean that I don't think that, like this, so these kids who go off in secondary school and specialise, in the arts shouldn't exist, because that's ridiculous for me to say that school simply shouldn't happen. It should all be the exact 100% the same. But the problem is, when people go into these things, go into it with a zeal, and instead of just being happy about the fact that it's working where it's working, yeah, by all means, if you want to join us, because I think part of the reason why that particular tweet got some pushback was because it was like, well, don't say that don't give me the criticisms. And it's like, well, some of those criticisms will be valid for people in their context. So instead of, I think it's probably the approach of it to some extent, which is, we're doing this amazing thing. Everybody should do it because it's the most amazing thing. And it's without thinking, well, it probably won't be the most amazing thing everywhere. And when it goes wrong, you can't really, what are you going to do about it? Because these children can only go to school once. They're only going to have that age once. I think the Commission has been very strong on that one, and fair play to her. She's right. You only get to go to primary school and secondary school once. So we should consider it, both teachers and parents, for the best of what's going to happen for those children. And so some flexibility needs to exist. But what we can't do is blanketly say this. The better approach would be, this is what we're doing. It works for us. Come and see if it's something that you're interested in. See if it would work for you. And then build your movement around that while accepting that other schools are going to be slightly different. Because I think that's just a better approach in education altogether.
Sure, yeah. Can I just pick your brains on one thought that's occurred to me while you were talking on this one, which is, it would at least be theoretically possible, I suppose, to have a situation where school for young people was 5 days a week, but for people working in the school, it would be 4 days a week. So in other words, you would have you'd have a schedule of staff so that the school would carry on the fifth day just as normal, but you would have a different set of teachers. So in other words, some teachers would have Monday off, others would have Tuesday off, and so on and so forth. Now, I just wondered what your thought was on that concept.
Well, would they get paid 1 day less as well? Do you see what I mean? Because technically,
no, I don't think they'd be keen on that.
Didn't get that. So again, you end up with a situation where probably not, and probably most teachers wouldn't be able to take a day off or take a day's pay cut. And if you're going to say, let's just hire other teachers, but again, depending on the context, that might not be helpful. Having lots of supply teachers in certain areas, or lots of turnover, or lots and lots of staff for certain children is not the best thing for them, either in primary or secondary, because actually it worsens the children's behavior. They, like young children in particular, want stable staff. They want to know that you're there. They want to know that you're coming in, and they need that stability, particularly the children who are the most vulnerable. So again, are we just going to make the situation worse? It's a good, but again, it may very well be that could work for secondary more than primary, because secondary have different teachers anyway. So do you see what I mean? It's a case of then building that relationship.
I do, and that's a really good point again you added there, which because theoretically in secondary you could schedule it if the resources were available, and I mean that's a whole different question, which clearly they're not at the moment, but you could schedule it so that it wouldn't mean a student would have different teachers for the same lesson, or supply teachers, because you just have the classes organized in such a fashion as that if you had Mrs. Smith on a Monday, Tuesday, and a Friday, then Mrs. Smith didn't work on a Tuesday, or whatever it happened to be. What you couldn't do is use that same model in primary. That clearly wouldn't work. But I mean, it's really an academic argument, because lovely in some ways for teaching staff as that might sound, the reality is that would mean you would need to, invest at least kind of 20% more than you currently do in education. And I think most of us agree that there isn't enough invested as it is in the current model. So the idea of investing 20% more to make that happen, and at the same time, you would be doing that whilst giving people less work in terms of actually being there. I think the chances of that happening, and the public agreeing to that, are, if it's possible to be negative, I think that pretty much is where it would be. So nice as the idea might sound in theory, I think might not be great for engagement, but the truth is we kind of agree, don't we?
Yeah, no, I think we do. I think there's just unless there's some sort of long-term something that we can see that long-term that has worked in multiple contexts, I don't think you can just roll it out, even if it sounds like a nice idea.
No, absolutely. Can I raise a topic just for a moment? And again, I'd like you to remind me of how this might might have an impact or not on primary schools. But the National Foundation for Education Research this week published a paper where they revisited the concept of skills and what they call EES, or essential employment skills, which I believe they refer to as communication, collaboration, problem solving, organizing.
I'm laughing because I could have ticked some of these off. Go on, carry on.
Yeah, no, I know. Planning, prioritizing, creative thinking, and something that they've called information literacy. And in the report, they are suggesting that a framework be created so that then these things can be assessed in some way. And that if schools don't address this agenda, then what's going to happen is that by, I think, 2035 it's cited, and what particularly is especially about 2035 I don't know, but let's take it 2035, the gap in skills in employment would significantly have an impact on productivity and therefore competitiveness. And I'm interested in your thoughts on this in a number of ways, Tarjinder. I mean, one of the thoughts that I've got is that I'm a little bit longer in the tooth in yourself. And I remember in the late 90s, one of the roles that I had was leading, and this is in the sixth form context, leading what were then called key skills. And key skills were a very similar list to the list of EES, skills that they've just given, but key skills involve, the usual kind of things, team building or problem solving and so forth. And we had to invent a whole elaborate means of then assessing key skills. So in chemistry, you would suddenly find that you had to set up some kind of experiment, and then you had to assess key skills in that experiment, and you had to then create a lot of evidence to be able to make that assessment. And then on the back of creating a lot of evidence, you also had to create some system by which the evidence was moderated so that there was some sense of consistency in standards. And this would then all feed into key skills qualifications. Now, this was all very fashionable back in the late 90s, and I suspect something similar had been mentioned or developed in the 70s, and no doubt before that too. But here we are again in the 2020s. And so that one thought is, are we just reinventing the wheel? And if it didn't work then, why would it work now? And secondly, some people, and I'm not saying this at all, but some people might argue, well, artificial intelligence does knowledge now. So we do need to move towards a more skills-based approach, because we can get all the information we need from AI, and therefore there's no need for anybody to know anything. We just have to work with the information that we've got. So what do you think to that?
I was laughing precisely because actually I remember the generic skills idea as well. And then it keeps cropping up. People, do you know what it is? It's wishful thinking. It is. It's wishful thinking. There are these generic skills that you can just somehow learn out of context and apply it to any context. Or you can just put it in, you can shoehorn it into any context you like. And what you were saying about the experiment is a good example of that. Now, it may very well have been that was a good time to collaborate, but it may very well also have been that was the point at which the students needed to do some independent practice, and that would have been the best thing for them, right? To help them with their independent problem solving. Do you see what I mean? Right?
Yeah, I do.
I don't have a problem with the actual skills they're talking about, but if you teach a broad curriculum properly, right, genuinely, you're probably going to touch on all of those. So you're probably better off, like say, for example, communication. as if you don't do that like every lesson every day,
Mm.
right? But do you actually implement it? Do you have good talk partners? Do you have, when you do have group discussions, are they good discussions? Do they have a basis? Have you set it up correctly? If you're talking about collaboration, okay, when have you done that? PE, for example, is a natural place where you would collaborate with other people. Do we teach PE very, very, do you see what I mean? Do we teach it well? And when there's places for it naturally elsewhere, can we add it in? But all the shoehorning, all that is ever achieved is detracting from the knowledge, detracting from the subject and the specificity of the domain. And so then we end up having a double whammy of losing out. They don't gain the generic skills. They don't actually exist in the generic form that they think they do, and they don't end up with the knowledge and the depth of subject that they should do. Or do you see what I mean? To be able to do some of those things. So sometimes you need a certain level of knowledge in a subject before you can collaborate. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's kind of, you know, that you having 3 children collaborate, none of whom know how to add properly, is not helpful to them. But that's what ends up happening, because then you've ticked your box of collaboration. And I completely agree. Ends up being this over elaborate assessment system, which is very vague and meaningless. It will be, or whatever criteria they come up with. The other thing, and I do have a bugbear about AI and knowledge at the moment. Look, I'm not saying what the end point of AI will be. I know where it is now. I also know there is a tendency among some people to just, anytime any technology comes out, just to run away with it. It's like, it's not there yet. And actually it makes lots of mistakes. So one of the hilarious mistakes it's been making is like with generative AI. Actually, I had a really good example on Blue Sky yesterday. Somebody was talking about Shrove Tuesday and saying, oh, it's not normally on in the March. And so she went up to, went and looked at ChatGPT or something like that, or one of these generative AIs, and said, oh, how many other March Shrove Tuesday have there been? So it kind of got 1 or 2 right, and then started generating the rest. And then someone pointed out and just went, and it was hilarious response, just going, shouldn't always trust generative AI, because actually it's wrong for this date. It wasn't actually in March on this year. So what it had done was actually take maybe 1 or 2 and then kind of generated the rest. You hadn't actually looked it up. So you'd have been better off actually looking it up on Google rather than asking this thing to produce it for you, because it was actually wrong. The other hilarious example is students wanting to sort of get AI to do an assignment for them, and the bot actually creating citations for them that are just not correct, just not real. So they haven't bothered to check it up, and it's just kind of created something and went, I think that's about right. You know, like, you've got to think that the technology is starting to be there. And I'm not saying where the end point will be, but we are jumping the shark if we're going to say, let's just leave it to AI now. You know, like, it's not there. It requires actually somebody quite knowledgeable, and it requires a lot of the good uses of AI that I've seen have come from people who are quite knowledgeable in the first place, who are actually training the AI themselves to do certain things, and actually setting the parameters and saying yes, no, not people who are just using it wholesale for certain things. And so I've been using it recently for to make certain things concise. But actually, when it does it, sometimes it does it and it makes logical sense to it. But I know that that's not correct, because I've got the domain knowledge to go, no, that you've moved away too far now if you write it like that. So it's been useful, but you still need somebody else. As for my general problem with this idea of employment skills is not that we shouldn't have employment skills, or that we shouldn't have this knowledge and skills that lead up to things that are useful in employment. But I do have a problem with employers thinking that they can shortchange their own employees by pushing onto schools the training they themselves should be doing that's specific to that job. And this is something that has actually happened in this country quite a bit, and it's something that employers need to face up to. They cannot keep thinking that it's somebody else's job to train their employees. Actually, in some ways, no matter what job it is that you're starting at whatever level, you are an apprentice in that respect. Even if it's not called an apprenticeship, it is an apprenticeship of some sort or form, because you're new and you need to invest. What you can't do is say, oh, well, schools should do this, because what they're not thinking of is, what are we not going to be teaching in order to teach that? And actually, will the children have the knowledge to do those employment skills in the first place? Because if you want to, for example, start talking about accounting, the amount of maths you need to even start accounting effectively is quite high. Actually, it's not as low as people think, and you need to be quite good at, sort of problem solving and really spotting where there are errors, etc. That's not going to happen overnight, and so they can't just turn around and say, well, you must do this, and then you can come to me ready to do the job. I don't have to train you at all. I just think that's a bit I think we indulge employers too much on that one.
No, I do agree. I mean, I think on that particular point, Tarjinder, I think I often draw a distinction between the word education and the word training. And it's particularly relevant in the sector that I work in, where you're obviously going into sixth form as well, and people are thinking about preparing for a specific job. But training, to me, is about preparing specifically for a particular job. Education is about learning about the world and preparing people for well, not just preparing people, but for giving people a better understanding of the world, because learning can be for adults as well as young people. Education, therefore, has a wider remit and a broader remit, and isn't just there in order to serve one particular industry or one particular trade, which in itself is fraught with danger because, of course, industries and businesses change and evolve over time. And if we're to assume that young people in education now are going to still be in the workforce in some sense 50 years from now, then it's pretty obvious that the economy won't look the same now, and the skills that will be required at that point won't be the same then as those now. So if we're too specific in the way that we educate our young people, we're missing the point, because at that point we're preparing them for the world as it is now, not necessarily as the world might be in the future. I think the whole thing of AI for me is yet another manifestation of an age-old debate, and the debate surfaced a lot round about the early 2000s, when it was about the internet, and at the time it was always put forward that everybody can Google something now. Other search engines are available, but everybody can search for information, so you don't need to know anything, do you? I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Daisy Christodoulou.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, well, I mean, she wrote and spoke a lot about that, and I have to say, I think she was pretty much spot on in what she said, in that she pointed out the obvious, which is that actually, if you don't know anything, then you can't know the information that you're being given is right or not. An analogy I draw is also with the Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's a famous scene in it where the protagonist has there's something which he can compute into that will work out the meaning of life, and after a long pause, then the computer works out that the meaning of life is 42. Well, of course, he has absolutely no clue what 42 actually means. And the point being that simply producing an answer like that gives you no sense of what anything means, and therefore no ability to do anything with it. So I think the reality is that actually people do need to know things very much. In fact, if anything, they need to know things more, because there's more information being thrown at them. And if they don't have, as you say, an ability to absorb that information and to make connections between different bits of information, but also that then they can relate it to domain specific information and knowledge, then I think it would just be churning out nonsense. It would be churning out things that have no meaning to us. So I think it is a big red herring to say that AI would take care of knowledge, and therefore all we should teach is skills. And finally, sorry, I'm perhaps running this out, but you mentioned the point about how teaching skills is it's an incidental thing. It's a byproduct in a way of what we do in schools, and nobody would for a second deny that we value communication or collaboration or problem solving. But I mean, they're just generic words. And in the context of teaching them, if you had a lesson like I have had to do, deliver a lesson on today, we're going to do problem solving. Well, that's like everything. Problem solving is everything. So it's nonsense to say that you revolve a curriculum or a lesson around these generic skills. What you can do is just emphasize that you want young people and adults to be able to do these things, and you take opportunities as a teacher to enable people to understand somebody else's point of view, or to communicate in a number of different ways, or to organize themselves. I don't know many teachers that don't do that already, frankly, whether the child's 5 years of age or whether the child's 17 years of age. So for me, again, I'm not saying these things are bad in themselves, they're great, but I think the idea of revisiting this concept by creating a framework and assessing it and creating a whole set of standards around it, I really don't. I don't relish the concept of revisiting that.
Well, I mean, unless the people involved are actually going to get into teaching and sort of help out, because for all the teachers that are going to leave because you just added all this bureaucratic nightmare to them,
Yeah.
And I can't look. It's not just teachers. I can't imagine a single teacher, leader of any sort who's just looking at that and going, "Great, yeah, no, you know what we're missing is another vague assessment system that we need to add top of all the other assessment systems that we actually do have to do. Yeah, that's what's missing, more workload. It's kind of like, actually sometimes people don't, again, it's one of those ideas, and I think you're right, sometimes these things do come from the corporate world and people don't actually think it through before they apply it elsewhere. And sometimes I think there are ideas from the corporate world that can work, but what has to be done is it has to be mediated by people who, in good faith. And one of the things is, like you say, if we've already done this, did anybody actually look at, say, when you're talking about the key skills that, I mean, I did it in primary, but not obviously in as formal a way as that, although we still did have to try and assess these things informally. But did anybody really think through before writing this document, well, why didn't it work last time? Because I wouldn't mind so much if somebody had actually been thinking, gone, well, why didn't it work last time? Why did people move away from it? Because part of the problem with these kind of bad ideas, I think in some ways social media is actually a good thing in this respect. I know it can be a bad thing as well, but actually people will call you up on it a lot more. Whereas before, I think you get away with these kind of cycle of bad ideas. Whereas now actually there's going to be a lot more pushback to this. And I think already has been, from what I've seen, of people saying, well, no, this isn't good enough. You've not thought it through. You've not even thought through what happened. And at least we can talk about it now as well and say, look, you've had your experiences of it. I've had my experience of it. I'm like, okay, so what have you got that's different? Because if you haven't got anything different, it's just me introducing a failed idea back into the classroom for you to try out again. Naturally, we can't keep trying out bad ideas. So if there's a gap, where is that gap coming from? And actually it'd be useful for us to actually collaborate with these people directly rather than it always coming from a third party. Because sometimes I'm wary of third party interventions within education because they've got nothing to lose. Do you see what I mean? With all, I'm sure that the people at the LFA are lovely, but they don't work in a classroom. They're not going to lose staff. Do you see what I'm saying? If you workload, you're going to have a shortage of teachers. They don't have to face that. So would it not be better off for them to not just to be listening to one, but to get people together more rather than them going off and talking to people and then almost talking at us afterwards? So I think that model of doing things is actually gone now. I don't think you can have that anymore. I don't think people in schools will accept it in the same way they used to.
I remember, absolutely, couldn't agree more. I remember a forum that I sat in, a long time ago now, which included a group of employers. And there was one particular employer who was very outspoken, a local employer. And he felt that schools weren't doing a good enough job. They weren't teaching young people the things that they needed to be able to succeed in their working lives. And so it was asked of this guy. They said to him, "Well, he's what do you want? What do you want young people to be?" And he said, "Well, I work. My business is a sock packing factory. We pack socks." So he said, "I want young people to be able to pack socks. I don't want them to be able to talk about, Charles Dickens or solve aquatic aquatic equations. I think that's something completely different. You know what I mean? Whatever equation it is. Yeah. He said, I don't want them to do that. He said, I want them to pack socks, and I want them to pack them really quickly. And it, it sort of made me think, well, you know, the world revolves around more than just your particular business and the needs of your immediate workforce, and that actually, you know, we're trying to introduce young people to their entire lives, not just serving as an immediate way of solving some problems for your sock packing business. So you can get into some very strange conversations on these things. I think I just need to mention again about our sponsors just for a moment. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, who are publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and join johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Teachers, join the Teachers Talk radio team in Manchester on Saturday, the 1st of March 2025 for Teachers Talk Connect, our biggest free event ever. Hear from main stage speakers, including Lee Parkinson, Mr. P, Kate Jones, and Vic Goddard. Attend subject-specific CPD sessions and experience amazing network opportunities too. Tickets are free for teachers and leaders. Just visit ttrradio.org to find out more and get your ticket today. So, Tarjinder, I think you wanted to talk about parental complaints.
Yes, so there's this story about a head teacher who has taken legal action and actually won against parents who were, in his words, issuing a harassment campaign. So the specifics of it are essentially, you know, there was a dispute between the parents and the school in terms of the administering of school rules around phones in particular. And what then happened was that the head teacher stood there, and they had, I think that there may have been opportunities. Now, I can't completely see the details of it because obviously schools can't always release everything, but I think there must have been, you know, there obviously was interactions, there was some support given, but the parents were like, no, you must make this, you know, this leeway about the school phone for my particular child. And in the end, he just had to say no, because this is a whole school rule. And what then ended up happening was these parents, and don't get me wrong, I do have a bit of sympathy for the parents, because apparently there was like an illness amongst one parent. I can understand that sometimes children are going through a hard time, families going through a hard time, and possibly certain things are allowed because it does make life easier. You know, like I assume that's what it comes down to. I'm not going to cast aspersions on someone in that situation, because it can happen. However, it's still the duty of the school to support the pupil and to have them within school and for them to follow set school rules. And I don't think it's not having a phone during the day. I mean, to be perfectly honest, all the evidence shows that it's best for the child anyway. So, you know, like in terms of their learning, I don't think there's any real dispute that the children having phones all day long is doing anything but harming their education. So even if it took support, fine. But what the parents did was, instead of just going through the complaints procedure, which they did take to Ofsted as well, and Ofsted threw it out, obviously they went through the normal routes, they chose to then separately have a social media campaign. And the harassment was so much that at one point, you know, the head teacher himself had to go home and speak to his own children and say, actually, please don't open the door to anybody if we're not in. And, you know, that is just, you know, just an awful state of affairs for him to feel that he had to actually do that. But essentially he's won. So, you know, there was enough evidence to suggest there was actual harassment. And this is something that keeps coming up, is that there is a real issue here in terms of parental expectations. Of what they can expect and the kind of exceptions that they can accept as well. And one of the things that Tom Bennett says quite often is that exceptions should be exceptional, because you can't just keep making exceptions because there's no more rules, you know. And to some extent, you know, there's not to say that parents can't challenge it. Is this rule really useful, etc. I think there's a useful conversation to be had there. But I think once you have a rule for the vast majority of the students, the vast majority of the time, it has to hold unless there's a good reason. And I do think the children themselves do pick up on it when you are being inconsistent for the wrong reason. So let me give you an example. There was a severely autistic child in the class, and in one of my classes, and sometimes he would make noises out loud. And this was a very young class as well. It was year 2. Very early on. But they didn't think that because he wasn't being told off and being given consequences, they understood that he actually couldn't help it. So the fact that we were making that exception for him, and we didn't tell him off, we knew that he was starting to get distressed, so obviously we supported him. But they also understood why they may get a consequence if they do something similar and shout out for no good. You see what I mean? Yes, it is. We are applying the rule slightly differently, but it was a fair rule in that case. Yeah. But the children also know when you're just being inconsistent, and actually that child who can cope is shouting out and you're not telling them off, and you're saying, well, I can also cope, but you're telling me off. Do you see what I mean? There's a massive difference in those circumstances, which I think sometimes parents themselves don't understand about the dynamics within class and within school, and what them asking for exceptions does to the internal dynamics of a school. Yeah, so there is the reality of that. And I don't just want to talk about the harassment, because I do think that there is a question here about parents as consumers. Because I think part of the reason why some of this is being driven is because parents see themselves as individual consumers of that school, and therefore the school should do what they want, as opposed to it being a collective enterprise. And while I can see that in some areas it's easier for schools and for parents just to go, actually, not what we want, let's move on. Say, for example, in London. In other areas, it's trickier, because if you live in a small rural area and you've only got maybe one school really close by, and it'd be really difficult, what do you do as a parent? Like, do parents get a choice in that situation, or do they simply have to take responsibility and move somewhere else? And is that acceptable? So I just wanted to throw out a whole load of questions at you as well on that one, see what you thought.
Well, I pretty well agree with everything you said. I couldn't disagree. I mean, I think there's a whole load of things there. But anybody in education, but particularly those who are, I suppose, most exposed, school leaders in particular, will know that the sheer number and unreasonableness of parental complaints and social media campaigns has absolutely exploded in the last, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, but probably for a bit longer than that. And I think that there are a number of reasons why. Some of them are societal, but I think that you're absolutely right that one of the ideas that is so corrosive and damaging is the one that parents are consumers, and that they are in a transactional relationship with schools, and that is wholly damaging, because it presents it like, and schools are encouraged to behave like they are, shops, and they are selling something, and their job is to please the customer, and therefore the customer is always right, and the customer can say or do whatever they choose to do. But of course, schools have a wider social responsibility. Their responsibility is to young people, not automatically to their parents, because sometimes parents want things that aren't necessarily in the best interest of all young people. And schools are the guardians of the development of young people in the broader sense. So all young people, not just one person's child, but all children. And of course, parents often don't look at things in that manner. So unfortunately, I think that's been part of the problem. And I think one other part of the problem is that the government, and Ofsted in particular, have, whether deliberately or subconsciously, encouraged that line of thinking. So I think it was Gavin Williamson, forgive me, Sir Gavin, if I misquote you here, but I thought it was Gavin Williamson that encouraged parents to complain to Ofsted whenever they had a grievance about something. And people, of course, in schools now are very familiar with it. Well, I'm going to Ofsted as a first line of response when their child has been given, I don't know, a behaviour point or a detention, or they've been told off, or whatever it might be. And people sometimes refer to their child being traumatized by being given um, by being given a simple consequence. You know, I've come across cases where people have said, you know, giving my child a detention is traumatic. Telling my child that that you know that they've made a mistake. My child never lies. My child never makes a mistake. We laugh because we've heard it, don't we? And I've got, you know, I have to say to sometimes parents, all children, including my own, lie. It's not to say that your child in this specific instance is lying cynically, but all children do. And it's both naive and quite actually damaging to start suggesting that, you know, suddenly there's a young person that absolutely never ever does. But more than that, there's this sense of entitlement, isn't there? There's this sense that I have the right to insult you. I have the right to gang up against you. And I do have an issue with, and I hope I very much doubt it. But if any Ofsted, anybody in Ofsted is listening, the idea that you can just put out a questionnaire to parents with 24 hours notice prior to an inspection, and then take literally on board the ratings and the comments. I know the comments were taken out eventually, but the ratings that parents give and take that as gospel is utterly ludicrous. You know, because all it well, I've come across plenty of examples where there have been social media campaigns behind the scenes by certain parents to organise certain types of responses, and as you said, plenty of school leaders and in fact some teachers have experienced more invasive you know, campaigns which have affected their home and their family and all kinds of horrible things besides, and it simply has to stop because it is so damaging to not only teachers and to people working in schools, but also to young people who do need guidance, who do need consistency, who do need the knowledge that there are some people who have their best interests at heart and are charged with that responsibility. They're not in a transactional relationship, they're not buying a product, they are receiving something because it is a public good. It's a good for society, not just because that particular child might benefit in one way or another at that particular moment. So it's a very it's a situation that is really serious in schools, and I hear relatively little in terms of answers from government or anybody else about how to address it. I've heard one or two, but not many.
I also think the other thing is that the system kind of favours the most unreasonable parent to some extent.
Yeah.
You know, in various places that I've been, I'm not saying every single school, because that's just not true. Because I think, you know, some places have got better systems than others. But where it's not gone quite right, it's like the system favours the most unreasonable parent, or particularly like when leaders are young, you know, like less experienced or don't have as much support. Sometimes they can also fall prey to that, and it's really hard for them. So, and I do feel for them, you know, like I do feel for anybody who's been in that position. So I've never been a head teacher, so there are things I don't understand about the role, and I get they're under pressure to keep everybody on board. But equally, it's kind of like if the person who shouts loudest is always going to be the person that heard, actually what happens to your more reasonable parents? Where do they get involved? Because sometimes they don't, and sometimes what happens is that they opt out. So a friend of mine, a really good friend of mine, actually, where she lived, she absolutely, you know, first of all was happy for her children to go to school. Behaviour was just awful, and in the end she felt, do you know what, particularly for primary, she felt, well, I'm educated enough, I don't want them to go there. So she kind of self-excluded herself from the system and home educated them. Now I don't think that's the best option necessarily for everyone. I think it worked for her because she's educated enough herself and was able to, you know, do what she needed to do to get them up to speed. But I think that's sad that she felt that she needed to do that, because actually for the inclusion of that parent, to make them happy, you've made her so unhappy she's taken her kids out. So like it's not like the school benefited as a result of her children leaving. And also that child who's being disruptive is not going to be any less disruptive. Because here's the other thing that sometimes people don't seem to understand is that, yeah, there are times when we can make an exception for a child because actually it solves the issue, So again, if I give an example, there was a child in my class who was very anxious, very ADHD, very anxious, and he just needed to be sat somewhere where he could actually see the visual timetable. He just couldn't cope with being sat in any sort of place where he couldn't see it. So we just had to make the adjustment for him, but that adjustment worked. Now, that's an adjustment that works. However, if you give a child an adjustment and that adjustment just leads to them demanding something else and then something else and then something else, that is not an adjustment that's working. Something else is happening there. And actually the parents and the staff have got to work together in that instance. And the parents themselves have got to understand they themselves, I think sometimes it happens more in primary, probably in secondary as well. But they just think, well, if I keep adjusting, it'll be fine. But actually they themselves find themselves in a position where they can't cope with their own child. So then some of the aggravation, I think, comes from their own frustration, or they think, well, I am doing the right thing, but even if it's not working, they want to keep themselves to it, but then that doesn't help us. So in some ways, even though I think it's sad this head teachers had to go and take legal action, part of me thinks there's going to have to be some cases here because it can't keep going on the way that it is. And we know that we've got shortages, and we know that we don't have enough people wanting to be head teachers and principals. We know this, and this, allowing these kind of campaigns to go on is not going to make that situation better. In the end, I don't know what they think is going to happen. There seems to be some sort of magical wishing world where they think that there's a school where every child can just do whatever they like and they'll all just be really happy. And whereas in reality, it's chaos, and the fact that parents who've been okay with that chaos and then confronted, and this is the story that we can't cover now, but the Monmouthshire one where, the head teacher was there going, well, actually I'm strict. I think it's because it's Wales that he was doing the Saturday detentions because they still have to give 24 hours notice, which we don't. And, but actually he has a point, which is, okay, if you want to criticise it, but what was going on before was that the teachers were striking and the behaviour was poorly and children felt unsafe. And actually in that situation, I think, but it shouldn't have to get to that point before a head teacher can push back. Do you see what I mean? Possibly the previous head teacher would have just felt like they couldn't. So it shouldn't then be that what we're doing is churning and burning head teachers in that situation. And it's only when it hits rock bottom do we allow them to be strict and have these rules and enforce them. Actually, I think we should be able to have systems in place much earlier that allow this to happen without parents creating that situation or children creating that situation where it becomes unbearable for everybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, well, one of the things is that in the heart of an idea of a consumer is that the consumer is just thinking about their interests. But of course, the school is thinking about the interests of all young people. So if one particular child does something, regardless of the reasons why it does it, it has implications for all the other young people. And those young people may suffer as a result of the actions of that individual. So it isn't just about what's right for that individual in an individual context. It's about what's right for the community and the collective whole. And it's also about preparing young people for the world so that they can cope. So it isn't about necessarily delivering something that will immediately gratify them or gratify the parents, but in the long run, say, 15, 20 years down the road, will that young person be properly prepared for life and coping with the world? And the world will not adjust and make constant readjustments and justify that person's actions if it's to the detriment of everybody else. So there has to be a step backwards away from the idea of parents as consumers and more towards the idea of trusting schools and school leaders in particular as the professionals, the people who have a responsibility and have spent their working lives thinking and working towards and dedicating themselves towards the service of the betterment and education of young people. You have to have that trust in that, but our society doesn't do trust, or it hasn't done a great deal of trust, and we've been fed this language, this business-like language, that what we're actually involved in education is a transaction, that it's about price, it's about demanding value as an individual from that system. It's about empowering the individual voice without realizing that there is a collective good, a collective whole. And that collective good and collective whole is not necessarily always synonymous with the demands of each individual. And no matter how much that individual might stamp their feet, it doesn't make it right that the school should bend to what they demand when they consider the best interests of all young people to be served by doing something different. And
Sorry to interrupt. I
yeah.
would say that on the whole, I absolutely agree with you, particularly when it comes to the content and stuff. The only thing that I would say is, and this is particularly because I do know someone who's involved, I do know that there are parents who've been seriously concerned about certain aspects of, say, RSE, that kind of thing, where they've been ignored by the school. And so what I would say is, actually, for all that I agree with you on like 90% of the time or 99% of the time, I think that there's been particular situations where I've had to go, actually, no, we haven't listened well enough within schools. Like what we can't do is go the opposite way and go, actually, we don't have to listen to you, or we always know best. But then the question is, do schools and do school leaders genuinely have the time, the ability to give parents a forum that is successful? And what I'd really like to know is schools where the school home partnership is really strong and how that is built. Do you see what I mean? Like, how is it actually built? And particularly if it's been fractious before, without actually it ruining the character of the school, but where parents feel like they're heard, but actually, you know, that they can see perspectives. But actually, I don't want us to become so closed off that we then end up going the opposite way and actually doing something that potentially is wrong too, because we just assume then, well, we know best and we can. Do you see what I mean? Like, when it comes to maths, I'm not going to take advice, but when it comes to other aspects, particularly where parents should have a say or do have a say for other reasons, I think we need to think that through. But again, it comes down to workload, it comes down to what forums are there and how can we open this up so we have a better relationship. But while it's being played out over social media or media itself completely, it's not going to work, and all you're going to have is defensiveness on both sides.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think though, you know, I'm not suggesting that people, you know, should just defer all the time to schools, and schools should have a carte blanche to do and say, just to say, please. I'm not for a second suggesting that. But what I am suggesting is that a lot of the things that are said and done are done because the parent has their own concerns at the forefront of what they're saying, rather than the wider social benefit. And if it's about curriculum, whether it's RSE or whether it's some other aspect of curriculum, it's a matter for society and it's a matter for government to decide what is or is not right or wrong, insofar as those things are concerned. It's not for individual schools to make up the rules on those things. And I think but once society has made that decision, and once there are proper, you know, checks and mechanisms that have been built in to ensure that you know, hopefully people are following those rules properly, then the argument should be with government and with you know, the people that make the rules in the first place, rather than with individual schools and with individual school leaders, who are, when all said and done, simply responsible for then you know, carrying out the wishes of the curriculum or the national curriculum or whatever the government you know, says is most important in schools. So I think that's important to stress as well. And I just think that as you say, if we continue to go down this route, we won't have many head teachers left. And I'm a head teacher, and I've been a head teacher for many years, so I've got some background in this. We simply wouldn't have any head teachers left. People are not going to continue to work in an environment where they are constantly open to you know, abuse and unreasonable demands or social media campaigns. And they're going to say, you know, hey, I can do something else, and that's to the detriment of the whole of society and young people as well. And that clearly is not the way that I don't think that we need to be going.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's us done now. I mean, we've had a really.
I think it is, yes. I think pretty much you agreed on everything.
But it's still been really interesting. So thank you for everybody who's been viewing, and hope to see you again next week.
Absolutely, and yes, and if you've enjoyed our show today, and you would like to find out a little bit more about what's going on at Teachers Talk Radio, just go to Teachers Talk Radio on all sorts of different media platforms, podcast platforms of your choice. You will find just about everything that you're interested in education on there, and you would be very welcome to come and find out more. Okay, lovely to talk today, Tarjinder. I will leave you there. Okay.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.